Ladies and gentlemen and brethren, good evening and welcome to this evening's Anderson Solomon Live. My name is Brodie. I have the honour of being the Provincial Communications Officer for the distinguished province of Worcestershire and also the honour of hosting these monthly webinars. And if you do have any questions for our very special guest this evening, please submit them via the question and answer facility on Zoom. But it's now time to begin. And this is a very, very popular Solomon Live, Freemasonry and the Royal Family. So without any further ado, would you please welcome our very special guest this evening, Prestonian lecturer, Dr. John Hawkins. John, how are you?
I'm fine, Brodie. Thank you so much for the invitation. I've been looking forward to it.
It's fantastic. A lot of people, quite seriously, very excited about this. So before we get to know you, why do you reckon people are excited about this particular Solomon Live? Why do you think that might be?
Well, my guess is it's something to do with the fact it's Jubilee month, and the royal family are as much in the headlines today as they ever have been in my recent memory. And I think perhaps just the topic has gelled a little bit. So anyway, I hope it proves worthwhile.
It will. Don't you worry about that. So what we always like to do, John, is get to know whoever our guest is first of all. So how did you become a Freemason? Why did you become a Freemason? How did that happen?
Gosh, I mean, that was a long time ago. I left university in 1973, and my first job was in the City of London. And the boss I worked for 2 or 3 times a week would book himself a taxi to take him to Great Queen Street. And I knew that's where Freemasons Hall was. So one day I said, are you going to Freemasons Hall? And he said, yes. And we had a conversation about this. And he eventually introduced me to a man called James Stubbs, who wasn't just the Grand Secretary, he was also the Secretary of the Apollo University Lodge in Oxford and Westminster and Keystone Lodge in London. And after a bit of conversation, it was decided that I'd be interviewed for Westminster and Keystone Lodge. And I had a fairly traumatic interview at the Connaught Rooms, but I was eventually accepted for the lodge and initiated in November 1974.
And look where you are now, the Prestonian lecturer for 2022. We've got to talk as well, haven't we? Have you got any Freemasons in the family? Because I've looked to my own past up and none in my family.
I've only got 2 that I'm aware of. They were both quite a lot older than me, and neither mentioned Freemasonry to me, but I suspect that was partly because I was 23 when I went into Westminster and Keystone, and they probably thought I was a little bit young to be asked. Anyway, one of them was an active Mason. He came along to my initiation, and he remained very close to me Masonically, you know, as long as he was alive. And his son is now a great Masonic friend of mine too. So yeah, two relatives only.
Now, I often say, John, in fact, most weeks, we've got Freemasons joining us this evening and non-Freemasons alike as well. So for those who are literally uninitiated and don't know what the Prestonian lecturer is, tell me all about it and how you got involved.
Okay, William Preston, after whom the lecturer is named, died in 1818. He was a very important Masonic educator and historian, and he instituted during his life a series of lectures on the craft degrees of Freemasonry. And when he died in 1818, he had £300 to fund a series of lectures based on the principles he had started. This continued till about 1860, when, for reasons I've never really established, the series ceased. But it was revitalized in 1924 and started again on a slightly different basis. When it was re-established, the idea was that the lecture would be given to educate and entertain a mainly Masonic audience. And that's really the only instruction given to Prestonian lecturers. The circumstances of my appointment is perhaps slightly unusual in that last year, there was thought that perhaps during Jubilee year, the Prestonian lecture might be on a subject related to that. So I was approached in February last year to see if I would potentially be interested. And it wasn't a subject I knew anything about. So with some hesitation, I said, yes, I'd be thrilled and honoured to do it. And so I spent most of last summer during lockdown doing the research on the topic I chose, which was the royal family and Freemasonry.
And it is a massive honour, isn't it, to be the Prestonian lecturer? How did that feel when you got that tap on the shoulder or that phone call or that email?
Well, I actually got a telephone call, and it was completely out of the blue. I mean, I think there are people who, are very talented Masonic historians for whom the Prestonian lecture is a natural progression. That certainly isn't the case with me. I mean, I only took up history seriously when I left employment about 10 years or so ago. Like a lot of people in my generation, you had to make a decision when you were about 14 as to whether you did arts or sciences, O-level and A-level. I did science, so I gave up history. And it was only when I retired that I went back to university and did a history degree. So I'm not a professional historian. So I was really quite surprised when I was approached.
And that's the point, isn't it? Because quite a few people might think that you're a historian or a writer, and of course you are, but that's not how you started out in life, is it?
No, I was in finance all my life, and thoroughly enjoyed it. I was, luckily I had a career with a few ups and downs, but on the whole, I was lucky to have a career that I enjoyed. But I just felt the time had come to take retirement and do something, perhaps a little bit more worthwhile, and hence, going back and doing history. I've done quite a lot of history research since then on a number of subjects, both Masonic and non-Masonic, and I've been commissioned to do a few books and papers. So it's been great fun. I've enjoyed the last 10 years very much indeed.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. It really does. Now, we need to begin, don't we? So how did the Prestonian lecture come about this year? Because there's an awful lot to celebrate this year, John.
Yes, there is. Well, the thing that occurred to me immediately is that we're celebrating 3 anniversaries this year, which are important to Freemasons. Clearly the 70th anniversary of the accession of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II to the throne is important for us because she is the royal patron of the principal Masonic charities. But it's also the 55th anniversary of the first election of His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent as Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England, and the 40th anniversary of the first election of His Royal Highness Prince Michael of Kent as Grand Master of the Grand Lodge Master Masons, as well as being the 40th anniversary of his appointment as Provincial Grand Master of Middlesex. He's now our longest serving Provincial Grand Master. So once I sort of realized that, the shape of the lecture just became reasonably clear that it would be an historical analysis of the Royal Freemasons, going back to the beginning, and cramming as much as possible into a lecture which lasts 40 minutes in its full version, but which is rather longer in the written version.
And you, if it's the right term to use, you performed in a quarterly communications, didn't you? And you had to do a slightly shorter version.
Yes, I mean, I was, again, quite thrilled to be asked to do it at QC last week. And I was given 20 minutes. I think I took 19. But that's about half the lecture and about half the slides. So, yeah, but it was fun to prepare for that. And again, I'm honestly asked.
It was well received. I had some wonderful things about it. So let's get to our topic properly. We've got to know you. Who were the earliest Royal Freemasons, John?
Okay. Premier Grand Lodge was founded in 1717. 20 years later, in 1737, the Prince of Wales, William Henry, who was the eldest son of George II, was initiated. He never became king. He died before his father, and he never achieved high office in the craft, but he was the first Royal Freemason of whom we have firm records. His younger son, the Duke of Cumberland, was also initiated, as were several of his brothers, and he became our first Royal Grand Master in 1782. And he served as Grand Master of the Premier Grand Lodge until his death in 1790, at which stage his place was taken by the Prince of Wales. Prince of Wales served from 1790 till 1812, when he was appointed Prince Regent, and felt it appropriate to stand down as Grand Master. Thereafter, I should say probably that William IV was also a busy Freemason, and 2 other brothers, the Dukes of Sussex and the Duke of York, both played very important parts subsequently.
And let's talk about the Dukes of Sussex and Kent, because I know they played a massive role, didn't they, in shaping modern Freemasonry. Tell me about that, please, John.
Okay. The Duke of Sussex took over Premier Grand Lodge, but meanwhile, a rival Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, had been formed in England, and they were in competition. And for about 10 years or so, from 1800 or so thereabouts, there had been discussions about the merger of these 2 lodges, and they were relatively successful. In 1812, when Prince of Wales stood down and Sussex was appointed, at the same time, the Duke of Kent was appointed Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the Ancients. And so in 1813, you had 2 royal brothers who were heading the 2 Grand Lodges. And that was the final catalyst which allowed the merger of those 2 Grand Lodges and the formation of the United Grand Lodge of England. It's gone on from there. The Duke of Sussex was a very firm Grand Master, and he was determined to see the success of the merger. And that's exactly what happened. And he stayed as Grand Master until his death in 1843.
And would you say that we owe them a lot where we are today?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there will be other lectures on other days about the constitutions and so on and so forth, which will be dealt with separately. But no, Sussex was a very determined man and very popular. When he died, there was talk of there being Masonic participation in his funeral, which didn't actually happen. But they did hold a special Grand Lodge in his memory. And he was a very, very popular Grand Master as well as a firm and successful one.
Oh, it's wonderful to celebrate him tonight, isn't it? Now, we're lucky enough to have the Duke of Kent and Prince Michael as rulers of the craft and marked today. Historically, here's a question for you. Which members of the royal family played important roles when we actually look back through the history of time?
Okay. Well, since the formation of the United Grand Lodge of England, I would probably choose three. The first would be Prince Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, who became King Edward VII. The second would be his younger brother, Prince Arthur, the Duke of Connaught and Strathearn. And the third would be Prince Albert, the Duke of York, who became King George VI. I mean, there have been others, but they were the three that I choose. Albert Edward was terribly important. He had a slightly unusual initiation, but after his initiation in the 1868, he became a past Grand Master, and then served as Grand Master from 1874 or 5, I think it was, until 1901 when he became king. And during that time, he was a very successful proponent of Freemasonry, and the number of lodges, the number of Freemasons increased absolutely dramatically. His brother, the Duke of Connaught, took over from him. Connaught was, again, a very driven man, very, very popular in the craft, and it was his idea after World War I to have the Masonic Million Memorial Fund, which was used to build what was then the Masonic Peace Memorial, which is now known as Freemasons Hall. And he was involved in other initiatives as well. King George VI was a very active provincial Grand Master of Middlesex, was very involved. And when he became king, he stood down. He was appointed past Grand Master, but unusually, he allowed himself to be inducted as past Grand Master in person, which wasn't common. And he also personally installed 3 Grand Masters, including his younger brother, the Duke of Kent. And he would have been installed the 4th, the Earl of Scarborough, had not sickness intervened, and he died the year after the Earl of Scarborough's investiture as Grand Master.
We need to go back a step, actually, because you mentioned an unusual initiation, did you not?
Yeah, I did. Albert Edward, I probably need to step back a little bit. Queen Victoria seems to have been very supportive of the Masonic charities throughout her life, and she was a patron of all the main Masonic charities. However, she was a very controlling person of both her sons and daughters, and she didn't like them doing things without her permission and could occasionally disagree with their wishes to do things, I think not so much out of spite, but out of wish to control. And certainly with regard to 2 of her sons, Prince Leopold and Prince Arthur, when she discovered they had been made Freemasons, she wrote to them expressing her disapproval that they'd done this without her permission. In the case of Albert Edward, he obviously been thinking about becoming Freemasons for some time, because correspondence exists showing that he had been in correspondence with the Deputy Grand Master and others. But he finally became, was initiated in Stockholm in Sweden in 1868 when he was on holiday. And he was initiated by Charles XV, who was King of Sweden and Grand Master of the Swedish Order of Masonry. Now, Swedish Masonry is a bit different to English Masonry. It's a 10-degree system, and it's a Christian degree system. So on the first day, he had not only the craft, fellow craft, and so the entered apprentice, fellow craft and master mason's degrees conferred, but also the next 2 in the Swedish system. On the following day, he had another 5 degrees. So by the time he came back to England, he'd got 10 degrees. And a letter exists on file where he rather sheepishly admitted to his mother that he had been initiated one in Sweden and hoped she wouldn't be too upset. But when he came back, because the system was different and not well understood in England at that time, he actually had to sort of persuade the Earl of Zetland that it had been a formal investiture initiation, and he was then invested as past Grand Master. And a few years later, on the conversion of the Marquis of Ripon to Catholicism, he took over as Grand Master. There were many things he did admirably. He was a very good attender at private lodges, he consecrated lodges. He wasn't too good at attending Grand Lodge. He only did that 5 times between his appointment as Past Grand Master and his mother's Diamond Jubilee. But he did an awful lot of good for the craft.
Now, what's wonderful about this conversation, and I really hope you enjoyed it too, ladies and gentlemen and brethren, is, John, there's so much to grab hold of. Every time you're talking, there's something for me to come back with. Queen Victoria. So any anti-Masonry, anti-Masonic, would you say?
Well, I don't think she was anti-Masonic, otherwise she wouldn't have been patron of Masonic charities.
Yeah.
But I think it was mainly a question of trying to control her admittedly rather unruly sons. But no, she was not only happy to involve in the charities, on at least one occasion, she participated in a Masonic foundation stone laying with full Masonic ceremonial. And that was at the foundation stone laying of the Royal Albert Hall in 1867, obviously, built in memory of her late husband. And images exist from illustrated papers of the time, showing her actually putting the cement on the block for the foundation stone with all of the senior Freemasons around her in the background. So no, I don't think she was anti-Masonic. I think she just didn't like people doing things that she didn't give approval for in advance.
Oh, that's good to hear. That would have been very disappointing to have heard that Queen Victoria was anti-Masonic. Now, I think we need to celebrate King George V. Was he actually a Freemason?
No, George V wasn't. In later life, he was reported as having said that he wished he had been made a Freemason when he was younger. But no, he wasn't. He was, however, an incredible supporter of the craft, as was his wife, Queen Mary. And they were also patrons of Masonic charities. And they also personally opened the Masonic Hospital, the new Masonic Hospital in Ravenscourt Park, West London in 1933, which he graciously allowed to be called the Royal Masonic Hospital. And the following year, they had a private tour of the new Freemasons Hall in Great Queen Street, given by his uncle, the Duke of Connaught. So George was a great supporter, but not a Freemason. Oh, incidentally, his daughter, his only daughter, Princess Mary, the Princess Royal, was also very supportive of the Masonic charities. And she, of course, eventually married the Earl of Harwood, who succeeded the first Duke of Kent as Grand Master when he was killed in an air accident in 1942.
Now, because we've mentioned Queen Victoria, we need to speak about Prince Albert. A lot of questions coming in asking, was he a Freemason?
No, his elder brother, Ernest, who succeeded as Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was an important Freemason in Germany, but Albert wasn't. He again, there's no evidence at all to suggest he was anti-Masonic. There's a letter on file written to him by his eldest daughter, Princess Victoria, who was also a Princess Royal, and her husband, Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia, who became Emperor Frederick III of Germany, was another important German Freemason. He was Grand Master of the Grand Land Lodge in Berlin. And apparently, shortly after they married, Victoria had started to ask him about some of his Masonic secrets, and he had declined to discuss it. So she wrote to her father saying, I'm not very happy about this. He wrote back and said, no, he's perfectly entitled to keep the secrets, and you should be sympathetic towards it. So no, Albert wasn't. He also, incidentally, did attend Masonic stone laying ceremonies. There's quite a famous image of him at the Royal Victoria Yacht Club, Cowes in the Isle of Wight, where he's laying a foundation stone. He's the only one not in Masonic regalia. Or everybody else is there, and they're Masonic banners, and quite an occasion. He wasn't the Mason, no.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. Now, we often talk about the big hitters. If we're talking about Masonry in the royal family, no doubt that's going to come up. But during your research, did you discover any lesser known members of the royal family who had a connection with Freemasonry?
Yeah, I mean, 2 spring to mind. Queen Victoria's 4th son was Prince Leopold, who became Duke of Albany. He was initiated in the Apollo University Lodge while he was a student at Oxford, and within a couple of years had become Master of the Lodge, and the following day was installed as Provincial Grand Master of Oxfordshire in the Sheldonian Theatre in a rather glittering ceremony in Oxford. He was noted in the Masonic press for his excellence as a ritualist, but sadly he had haemophilia and he died at the age of only 32. So he had a brief but shining Masonic career. The other one who's quite often forgotten these days, certainly in the Masonic context, is Prince Albert Victor, who was the elder son of Edward VII. And Albert Victor was also initiated and in fairly short order became Provincial Grand Master of Berkshire. Again, he took his job very seriously, but he died of pneumonia at the age of 28. And so he sort of, again, doesn't figure greatly in history. So they're the main two that I'd say of the minors that one might not have come across otherwise.
And heartbreaking that they passed so young.
Yeah.
Heidi has been in touch, and Heidi wants to know, are any members or have any members of the royal family been women? Because obviously we've got two women orders within Freemasonry.
Well, it's interesting you should say that. I've been asked that question before, and I have asked the question of Lady Freemasons, and they have all said that not as far as they know, but I've never researched those records, so I can't say that for certain. But to the best of my knowledge, the answer is no.
So we know that Prince Michael of Kent is Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Master Masons.
Yeah.
Has there been a long connection with the royal family and Freemasonry beyond the craft? Because perhaps there's a few people watching this evening who think Freemasonry is the one, the two, and the third degree, but there's a little bit more to it.
Yes, in fact, there's a remarkable amount of that connection. In fact, when I was doing the research, there was so much material available on royal family memberships beyond the craft, and indeed beyond the United Kingdom, beyond England, that I've got plenty of material left for a second lecture, which I hope to give at the Grand Stewards lecture next year, with a work entitled Royal Family Freemasonry Beyond the English Craft. But to go back specifically, as early as King William IV and King George IV, it was customary for the Grand Lodges of Ireland and Scotland to appoint them as honorary or past Grand Masters. I don't think either of those ever actually attended either of those lodges, but they were appointed. Coming on a bit later, Prince of Wales, Edward VII, was appointed a past Grand Master of the Scottish Order, and indeed I think of the Irish Order as well. And his brother, the Duke of Connaught, was not only an honorary past Grand Master of these, he was also Great Prior of the Knights Templar in Ireland for about 50 years. I mean, it was a remarkable period of time which he served. So there was that. The King Edward VII served as Grand Master for the KT and the Mark, as did the Duke of Connaught. The first Duke of Kent served as Grand Master of the Mark, the father of our current Prince Michael, of course. Current Duke of Kent is Grand Patron of the Ancient and Accepted Rite, and there have been many other things as well. So it's a very, very long list.
And do you think people are surprised when they hear that Freemasonry for the royal family is a little bit further afield than just England?
Well, I guess we live in the present, and we don't necessarily think about how England was sort of ruled in the past. And Ireland, of course, was an integral part of the United Kingdom. And as recently as 1924, after Irish independence, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, became Edward VIII, became an honorary senior Grand Warden of the Grand Lodge of Ireland. I think he was delighted to be asked, and correspondence suggests that he wanted to take it in person, but I think he was probably advised not to. But he also served as Deputy Grand Master and Governor of the Royal Order of Scotland in Edinburgh. And his brother, Duke of York, who became George VI, was actually Grand Master Mason of Scotland briefly, just prior to his accession. They're the most active ones. Beyond that, in some of the more obscure corners of the world, Edward VII was a past Grand Master honorary of the Grand Lodges of Romania and Egypt. And the Duke of Connaught was also a past Grand Master honorary of the Grand Lodge of Canada. So yeah, they got about a bit.
And let's talk about King Edward VIII, later Duke of Windsor, of course.
Yeah.
Would you say that he was a keen Freemason?
Well, this is a very interesting question. On the day of his initiation, he had to respond to the toast of the initiate, and that response was recorded in the Times the next day. And it was full of the things you'd expect him to say, along the lines of how wonderful it was to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather and his great uncle, and so on and so forth, and how he was looking forward to doing his bit for Freemasonry and the Masonic principles. Later the same evening, he wrote a letter to his longtime mistress, Frida Dudley Ward, saying what an awful evening it had, and how he was not looking forward to Masonic meetings when he had to listen to long, boring speeches. I think this was a bit of bravado on his part, because he soon started joining other lodges, and he was appointed Provincial Grand Master of Surrey, and by all accounts did a pretty good job, not just as PGM in terms of the active lodges, but also in terms of the charity there. And he obviously had to give up when he succeeded to the throne, but after his abdication, he did continue to visit lodges from time to time, including when he was governor of the Bahamas during the war. So I think he might not have been thrilled at the outset, but he certainly did his bit for the craft.
There's room for us all, John. There's
Yes.
room for us all. A few people would like to know, what is the connection with royalty and stone laying ceremonies?
Until about, I'm going to say 1919, but I might have the year wrong. The Book of Constitutions used to include a ceremony for the laying of foundation stones. Okay. And I don't know why it was taken out in 1919, but it was. And up until about that time, any major building up and down the country, including Wales, Ireland, Scotland, as well as England, if there was a foundation stone to be laid, you tried to get a member of the royal family to come and lay it. And if it was one of the royal family who were Freemasons, then they would turn up in quite spectacular regalia. And there was a whole ceremony, a bit like a consecration of a lodge, and similar tools. The consecration vessels were similar. And again, if you go to the Museum of Freemasonry, you will see a set of working tools that were actually given to Edward VII when he laid some foundation stones at the new docks in Bombay during one of his visits to India. And these are remarkable, made of ivory, and they're inlaid with diamonds and other precious stones. And they're actually, I think, on display in the vestibule of the Grand Temple at the moment as part of a small display there. And they clearly enjoyed doing it until really quite recently, particularly for the RNIB, when new homes have been laid, if Duke of Kent or the Duchess of Kent or others have laid them. That's quite often been done with ceremony of some sort, although less so wearing regalia these days. So if you go online, you can find all sorts of old movie clips of stone laying ceremonies. The famous one being the new playhouse at Stratford-on-Avon, and it's an old black and white thing without any sound. It's a bit juddery, but there's this fabulous Masonic procession which is well worth watching. It's only 5 minutes. So.
Oh, I've seen it. It's fantastic. It really is definitely worth going to find and track down, ladies and gentlemen and brethren, but only after we finished this evening's Solomon Live. Thank you very much indeed. Now, here's an interesting one. In total, how many members of the royal family have been Freemasons over the last, what do you reckon, 200 years or so?
Right. Well, if you go back to 1737, which is like 285 years or whatever, then depending on your definition of royalty, the normal count is 23 or 24. Now, in addition to that, 4 royal princesses have married Freemasons. The most recent example, of course, being His late Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. So if you count those in as well, about 27, 28. It's a longer list than I anticipated when I started to do the research.
And do you think people are surprised by that?
It surprised me. So I guess it might surprise some others. To be fair, I mean, this question does get asked, and the Library and Museum have an information leaflet. They have a series of information leaflets. Information leaflet number 1 is on the royal family and Freemasonry. And it's quite, if you forget about my lecture, if you want to read anything on the royal family, that information leaflet does actually give a list of their names and their lodges and the grand offices they got to and so on and so forth. It's an interesting piece of documentation.
And whilst we're on that topic of surprise, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's quite a few questions that are coming up that have different people coming up with them, if you will. And one of them is, were you surprised by much of the research that you did? Because obviously you put blood, sweat, and tears into this. Was there anything else that surprised you along the way?
Yes, a few things. I was extraordinarily lucky, and despite the lockdown being in progress, the Royal Archives at Windsor, which I had the privilege of visiting on a previous occasion, did provide me with a lot of information, in fact, scans of information. So there were a lot of letters, the original letters there, which I don't think had been in the public sphere for previously. And of course, the Library and Museum of Freemasonry in Great Queen Street were also incredibly helpful. And in fact, Grand Lodge also made available some archives which hadn't actually been transferred to the museum, but which were in the sort of private archives. So some of those were absolutely fascinating. Without going into too many details, I mean, there was one incident where Edward VIII, when he was Prince of Wales, wished to have Wallace Simpson's husband become a member of a lodge, which he did. And again, this is well known. It was reported in the newspapers at the time, but I hadn't realised the original documentation still existed in Grand Lodge. And there were various other things as well, where I mean, a classic one was Edward VII, as Prince of Wales, was invited to unveil a portrait of the Earl of Carnarvon at Freemasons Hall at a Grand Lodge meeting, and to install the Lord Chancellor Baron Herschel, who he knew very well, as senior Grand Warden. And the letter survives from his private secretary, where he declined on the basis that he had to go to the 2,000 Guinness at Newmarket that day, so he wasn't available to go to Grand Lodge. And so things like that turned up, which I hadn't necessarily expected to see. Most of those are referred to in the lecture, if people want to read it.
And we're going to talk about your wonderful lecture a little bit later on, because another question that keeps coming up quite a lot is how do we get to see it? So we can get to that in a while. Now, I know that the Museum of Freemasonry contains important Grand Lodge archive material. Does it contain any exhibits associated with Royal Freemasons, and can we go and see them?
Well, yeah, they have an enormous amount of such material. I mean, several members of the royal family on their deaths have had their regalia and jewels transferred to the library and museum for safekeeping. And some of the jewels are absolutely exquisite. If you or I get a Masonic jewel, it's probably made of plastic or base metal and worth less than nothing. Some of these gold jewels, and 18-karat gold jewels at that, which were worn by members of the royal family, with beautiful enameling. I mean, goodness knows what they're insured for, but it must be tens of thousands, I would imagine. And a lot of those are in Grand Lodge Museum and occasionally displayed. In addition to that, the working tools I mentioned, the ivory working tools, consecration vessels, they're kept there. Some more mundane items. Edward VII, when he visited Grand Lodge, which he didn't do very frequently, had his own set of hairbrushes reserved for him, ivory-backed hairbrushes. They're still on display, and his green dispatch box, where they used to send him documents for signing. Famously, Queen Victoria wouldn't let him have a red dispatch box for state documents. So I think he must have been quite pleased to have his own green dispatch box for once Freemasons Hall. They've still got that. And then there are other things as well, but they're worth taking a look at.
Duke of Kent, has he seen, Grandmaster, has he seen your lecture?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
Maybe he's on tonight. So
well, who knows?
Wonderful to have you here. We can neither confirm nor deny if he's here this evening.
Right. I haven't been advised.
That'd be wonderful, wouldn't it? That'd be absolutely wonderful. For anyone who wants to hear the delivery of the Prestonian lecture, John, what's the format of getting in touch with you? Because you travel everywhere to deliver this, don't you?
Right. Each year there are normally 3 formal deliveries of the Prestonian lecture, and this year the first one was held at the Lodge of Economy in Hampshire and Isle of Wight. That was a few months ago. The next formal delivery is in Birmingham in November at the Warwickshire Provincial Grand Stewards Lodge. And then the final delivery, probably also in November, possibly early December, is at my mother lodge, Westminster and Keystone Lodge in London. And if anybody wants to go to either of the formal ones, if they get in touch with the Grand Secretary's office, their name will be passed on to the Lodge Secretary and they'll get an invitation to attend in due course. In addition to that, you can give the lecture informally as many times as you're invited and wish to accept. So I've done a few of those already, and the remainder of the year I've got about a dozen bookings already. Belfast, Cardiff, 2 in Edinburgh, Cambridge, Norwich, Swindon, Cheshunt, various other places. But again, if anybody is desperately keen to see if there's a place near them where I'm giving it, then again, if they get in touch with the Grand Secretary's office, they'll have a list of my deliveries and they can sort of pass it on to the secretaries of the lodges concerned. So yeah, that's the idea.
I think there will be a lot of people who are joining us this evening who would love to see the Prestonian lecturer in the flesh, so to speak, and witness that great lecture firsthand. Aprons, royal aprons, who makes them? We've been asked.
Good. Well, I have no idea. I mean, the ones I've seen have generally had the little tags on for the normal suspects. The old firm of Toy and the old firm of Spencer and various other firms now gone by the wayside. Some of those firms were, and still are, of course, very skilled in what they do, not just making aprons. There's a box at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, which is a casket, and it's a blue velvet casket about that sort of size. And it's the casket that contained the royal address from the Freemasons of England to Queen Victoria on celebrating her 50th anniversary. And this was handed to her by her son and others. And it's in blue velvet with the most magnificent silver gilt medallions and royal cipher. And this was made by George Kenning. And he obviously did a lot of the aprons as well. And some of this workmanship was absolutely stunning. But if you go to Osborne, it's worth asking them to show you the royal address box.
Wow, no, absolutely. John, we're running out of time. Time for just a few more questions, I guess. And you perhaps answered this one already. When you look back at all the hard work you've done for your Prestonian lecture and the information you've discovered about members of the royal family, who would you say has been the most prolific Freemason out of them all?
Well, I suppose it depends how you define prolific, but almost certainly the Duke of Connaught, because the Edward VII did what he wanted to do, and that was a lot of private masonry and a few grand festivals and stuff like that. But he wasn't diligent in his attendance at Grand Lodge. The Duke of Connaught not only did his private masonry and his foundation stone laying, but he travelled the world promoting English Freemasonry, and was very, very diligent. And he reigned for 38 years, which until, of course, our present Grand Master, the Duke of Kent, was the longest anybody had served. So I think you'd have to give it to Connaught. And I think he well deserves having the Connaught rooms named after him.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. Thank you. John, I've loved talking to you. I think everybody's been hanging off your every word since we started at 7:30. I've seen some wonderful comments. So what's next for you? Because I should imagine by the research that you've done, this could take you somewhere else now. Maybe some more investigation of the royal family, maybe different areas.
Well, actually, I don't think that will be happening. As I said, I've got enough material for a lecture on the royal family beyond the English craft. I've also got enough material to do a lecture on the royal family and the Masonic charities, which I really haven't covered at all with what we've been discussing this evening or in the other lecture I described. And so those two lectures sort of exist in draft form with slides and so on and so forth. So I'll tidy those up over the next few months. But this year I'm concentrating on getting the lectures out of the way. And I'm also starting a new university degree course in September this year on a different subject entirely. So that's going to be keeping me busy from September onwards.
Oh, wonderful. John, have you enjoyed yourself? Have you enjoyed your Solomon Live experience?
I have, thank you.
It's been wonderful to have you, honestly. And a lot of people are asking if they can watch this again. Well, the answer is yes, you can, because we record all of our Solomon Lives, and we're going to give you the opportunity to watch them again and give those the opportunity who weren't here this evening to witness what we've seen this evening. John, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the show. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much indeed for joining us. Our next Solomon Live, would you please put it in your diary, will be Tuesday, the 12th of July. And that is when we shall meet the Metropolitan Grand Master, Sir Michael Snyder. And that will be 7:30 on Tuesday, the 12th of July. But we won't let you forget that, as always. And if you haven't done so already, please, please, please make sure you track down Solomon. There are so many wonderful things on there to advance you in your masonry. solomon.ujle.org.uk. And until our next happy meeting, take care, everybody, and we'll see you very, very soon.